It's 2022, and in Los Angeles, a text message pings on thousands of phones simultaneously. The message is brief, almost cold. Sunday services have been canceled indefinitely. For members of what was once the world's most powerful megachurch, this wasn't just an announcement. It was the collapse of an empire that had taken 40 years to build and mere months to destroy. But here's what makes this story genuinely disturbing. This wasn't the first warning sign. In fact, the cracks had been visible for years, hidden behind perfectly produced worship songs and Instagram-filtered images of faith. Sydney, Australia, 1983. A basement in the northwestern suburb of Balcombe Hills becomes the unlikely birthplace of what would become a global phenomenon. Brian Houston, a 30-year-old pastor with ambition burning in his eyes, stands before a congregation of 45 people. His father, Frank Houston, is already a prominent figure in Australian Pentecostal circles. But Brian wants something different. He doesn't want a church. He wants a movement. He looks at those 45 faces and makes a promise that sounds absurd. This church will change the world. And here's the thing, he wasn't entirely wrong. Within 5 years, those 45 people became 5,000. The church that started in a basement was now filling school halls, then community centers, then purpose-built auditoriums. But Brian Houston understood something that traditional churches didn't. Christianity in the modern age needed a rebrand. Gone were the somber hymns and organ music. In their place came rock concerts with light shows, fog machines, and sound systems that cost more than most churches' annual budgets. The worship band didn't look like your grandmother's choir, they looked like they should be opening for Coldplay. By 1999, Hillsong had done something remarkable. They'd created a music division that would become more influential than the church itself. Shout to the Lord, written by Darlene Zschech, became one of the most sung songs in Christian history. It wasn't just played in Pentecostal churches, it was being sung in Catholic masses, Methodist services, and Baptist congregations across every continent. The song generated millions in royalties, and suddenly, Hillsong wasn't just a church. It was a brand, a business, and a cultural force. Let me paint you a picture of what Hillsong became at its peak. Imagine walking into a Sunday service at the Hillsong Convention Center in Balcombe Hills. You're not walking into a church. You're entering what feels like a concert venue. The coffee is artisanal. The bookshop sells not just Bibles, but lifestyle merchandise, journals, and clothing lines. The ushers are attractive, well-dressed, and trained to smile like flight attendants. The music, when it starts, doesn't creep in quietly, it explodes. Drums thunder, guitars soar, and a light show worthy of a U2 concert bathes everything in perfect Instagram-ready hues. This isn't your parents' church. This is church for the smartphone generation. And the growth was exponential. London in 2000, Stockholm in 2016, New York City, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Dallas. By 2018, Hillsong had expanded to 28 countries with an estimated global attendance of 150,000 people. But these weren't just numbers in pews, these were devoted followers who bought the albums, attended the conferences, volunteered countless hours, and most importantly, tithed faithfully. The church's annual revenue was estimated at over $100 million. For comparison, that's more than many Fortune 500 companies were making in profit. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn, and trust me, this is just the beginning. Hey, quick question for you watching this. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious about how far this story has reached. And if you're finding this deep dive valuable, the super thanks button really helps keep Professor Archive running. But either way, let's get back to this unraveling empire. Frank Houston, Brian's father, was supposed to be a pillar of the movement. He'd been a successful pastor in New Zealand before moving to Australia, and his reputation brought credibility to his son's growing empire. But in 1999, something happened that Brian Houston would spend the next 2 decades trying to bury. A young man from New Zealand, Brett Sangstock, came forward with allegations that would shatter any normal organization. He claimed that Frank Houston had sexually abused him as a child, over several years in the 1960s and 70s. Now, here's what makes this unconscionable. Brian Houston admitted he knew about these allegations in 1999. His father confessed to the abuse. But what did Hillsong do? Frank Houston was quietly retired. No police report was filed. No public announcement was made. The survivor was paid $40,000 in what the church called pastoral support, but what any reasonable person would call hush money. And the church, the movement, the empire continued to grow as if nothing had happened. Frank Houston died in 2004, his reputation largely intact within Hillsong circles. Brian Houston continued to lead the church to unprecedented heights. But here's the thing about secrets in the digital age. They don't stay buried forever. In 2014, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse began investigating how various organizations, including churches, had handled abuse allegations. Hillsong was called to testify. Brian Houston was called to testify. And under oath, the carefully constructed image began to crack. Houston admitted he'd known about his father's abuse since 1999. He admitted he hadn't reported it to police. His reasoning? He didn't believe he had a legal obligation to do so at the time, and he wanted to protect the victim's privacy. Critics called it what it actually was, protecting the institution at the expense of justice. In October 2021, Brian Houston was charged with concealing his father's sexual abuse. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who'd built the world's most influential megachurch, who'd counseled prime ministers and presidents, who'd been a spiritual advisor to celebrities and athletes, was facing criminal charges for allegedly covering up child abuse. The trial wouldn't conclude until 2022, when he was ultimately found not guilty on a technicality regarding the specific legal requirements of the charge. But the damage to Hillsong's reputation was catastrophic. But if you think that's where the story ends, you haven't been paying attention to the pattern. Carl Lentz was, in many ways, the American face of Hillsong. Handsome, charismatic, with a fashion sense that leaned more towards streetwear than clergy robes, Lentz transformed Hillsong New York City into the church for celebrities. Justin Bieber was baptized by Lentz in NBA player Tyson Chandler's bathtub. The Jenner sisters attended. Kevin Durant, Vanessa Hudgens, Selena Gomez all became part of what the media called the Hillsong Hollywood phenomenon. Lentz appeared on television shows, in magazines, and became the pastor that secular media actually wanted to interview. He made Christianity look cool, accessible, and relevant in a way that terrified traditional denominations and thrilled Hillsong's leadership. Until November 2020, when Brian Houston released a statement that sent shockwaves through the church, Carl Lentz had been fired for leadership issues and breaches of trust, plus a recent revelation of moral failures. The carefully vague language didn't stay vague for long. Lentz admitted to infidelity. Then the details began emerging. Not just one affair, but a pattern of behavior. Multiple affairs, abuse of power. Staff members came forward with stories of manipulation, spiritual abuse, and a culture of fear within Hillsong, New York. One woman, Leona Kimes, went public with allegations of a months-long affair with Lentz, describing how he'd used his spiritual authority to manipulate and control her. She described a man who preached humility on Sundays and lived like a celebrity the rest of the week, with the church credit card funding designer clothes and expensive dinners. But here's what should disturb you more. The internal documents and testimonies that emerged suggested that Hillsong's leadership knew Carl Lentz was problematic long before 2020. There were complaints about his behavior, concerns about financial irregularities, questions about accountability. But Lentz was bringing in the crowds and the money, so he was protected until protecting him became impossible. And then the floodgates opened. When one leader falls, others start to look around nervously, wondering if they're next. Reed Bogard and Josh Brent, pastors of Hillsong Dallas, resigned in 2020 after admitting to inappropriate behavior. The details were again vague, but former members spoke of manipulation, spiritual abuse, and a culture where questioning leadership was treated as questioning God himself. In 2021, Pastor Tom Payne from Hillsong's Kansas City campus resigned after allegations of sexual misconduct. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was a systematic pattern emerging across multiple campuses on multiple continents. But perhaps no scandal cut deeper than the revelations about Hillsong's treatment of LGBTQ individuals. For years, Hillsong had maintained what they called a welcoming but not affirming stance. Gay and lesbian individuals were welcome to attend, but they couldn't serve in leadership, couldn't participate in worship teams, and were encouraged to pursue either celibacy or healing from their sexual orientation. Multiple former members came forward with devastating stories of conversion therapy practices, of being told their identity was sinful, of being pushed toward heterosexual marriages that ended in trauma and broken families. Jazz Jennings, the transgender activist and television personality, spoke publicly about her traumatic experience with Hillsong, describing manipulation and harmful practices disguised as spiritual care. Josh Canfield, who'd been in a same-sex relationship, was allowed to participate in Hillsong's reality show, and even invited to speak at events but was later removed from leadership when his relationship became public. The inconsistency was glaring. Hillsong wanted to appear progressive and accepting to the outside world, while maintaining conservative positions that caused real harm to vulnerable individuals within their community. By mid-2022, the situation had become untenable. Brian Houston, still facing his legal issues, was asked to step down from all leadership roles. His wife, Bobby Houston, who'd been a co-founder and leader of the church's women's ministry, stepped down as well. But the revelations about Brian didn't stop with his father's abuse cover-up. In 2022, it was revealed that Houston had been investigated for inappropriate behavior toward two women. One involved sending inappropriate text messages to a staff member. Another involved allegations of entering a hotel room of a female guest uninvited during a conference in 2019 while allegedly intoxicated. Houston claimed he was disoriented and entered the wrong room by mistake. But the incident added another layer to the mounting evidence of a culture where powerful men faced little accountability. Now, let's talk about the money, because this is where the story becomes truly staggering. Hillsong operated with a level of financial opacity that would make most nonprofit organizations blush. As a religious organization in Australia, they weren't required to file detailed financial reports. What we do know comes from leaked documents, testimonies from former staff, and investigative journalism. The numbers are breathtaking. In 2019 alone, Hillsong's global operations generated an estimated $100 million in revenue. Brian Houston's compensation package, while never fully disclosed, was estimated to be in the vicinity of $1 million per year when you factored in salary, housing allowances, travel budgets, and other benefits. The church owned multiple properties worth millions, maintained private jets for leadership travel, and spent lavishly on production costs for conferences and albums. But here's the disturbing part. When scandals hit and members started leaving, there was no financial safety net for the staff members who devoted years of their lives to the organization. Dozens of staff members across various campuses were laid off without severance packages. Volunteers who'd given thousands of hours of free labor suddenly found the community that had demanded so much from them had nothing to offer in return. Former members began speaking out about the financial pressure they'd faced. Tithing wasn't just encouraged, it was spiritually mandated. If you weren't giving 10% of your income to Hillsong, your faith was questioned. Some testimonies described being told that financial struggles were the result of not tithing faithfully. Young adults working minimum wage jobs were encouraged to give sacrificially, assured that God would provide. Meanwhile, the leadership wore designer clothes, drove luxury cars, and lived in multi-million-dollar homes. The volunteer culture at Hillsong was particularly exploitative. To be part of the dream team, as volunteers were called, required a massive time commitment. Some volunteers worked 20, 30, even 40 hours a week for the church, setting up equipment, running soundboards, managing social media, coordinating events, all without compensation. The promise was that you were serving God, building the kingdom, and being part of something bigger than yourself. The reality was that Hillsong's business model depended on thousands of people providing free labor so that the organization could generate massive profits that benefited a select few at the top. By the end of 2022, the collapse was in full swing. Hillsong's Boston campus shut down. Dallas closed. New Jersey closed. Phoenix closed. The London campus, which had once drawn thousands, was struggling with attendance in the hundreds. The Sydney headquarters, which had regularly seen over 30,000 attendees across multiple services each weekend, was seeing less than half that. The music division, which had been the church's most successful brand, was in freefall. Albums that once topped Christian music charts were barely making an impact. Worship leaders who'd been household names in Christian circles were leaving, many denouncing the culture they'd been part of. But here's what I find most fascinating and disturbing. Throughout all of this, there were people defending Hillsong, diehard members who claimed this was spiritual warfare, that Satan was attacking the church because it was so effective. Some blamed the media for exaggerating the problems. Others claimed that the victims and whistleblowers were disgruntled ex-members seeking attention. This kind of cognitive dissonance is common in high-control religious organizations. When your entire identity, social network, and worldview are built around an institution, acknowledging its fundamental brokenness means acknowledging that you might have been complicit in harm, that you might have been deceived, that years of your life might have been given to something rotten at its core. That's a devastating realization, and some people will do anything to avoid it. There's a psychological phenomenon called the sunk cost fallacy, where people continue investing in something because of how much they've already invested, even when it's clearly failing. For many Hillsong members, walking away meant admitting that the thousands of dollars they'd tithed, the countless hours they'd volunteered, the relationships they'd built, the life decisions they'd made based on the church's teaching, all of it might have been based on a lie. Some people chose to double down instead. But the numbers don't lie. From an estimated 150,000 global attendees at its peak in 2019, Hillsong had lost more than half its congregation by 2023. Some estimates put current global attendance at around 60,000, and that's being generous. Multiple campuses have closed entirely. Staff has been cut dramatically. The annual conferences that once drew 20,000 people to Sydney are shadows of their former selves. The music ministry that revolutionized contemporary Christian worship is struggling to maintain relevance as former members and leaders launch their own independent worship projects, deliberately distancing themselves from the Hillsong brand. In January 2023, Phil and Lucinda Dooley took over as global senior pastors of Hillsong Church. They inherited an organization in crisis, with collapsed credibility, mounting debts, legal battles, and a fractured global network. Their task is essentially impossible. How do you rebuild trust when the foundation itself was corrupt? How do you convince people to follow new leadership when the previous leadership demonstrated such catastrophic failures of character and judgment? The ripple effects of Hillsong's collapse extend far beyond the organization itself. Thousands of former members are now processing religious trauma, realizing that what they experienced wasn't just bad leadership, but systematic spiritual abuse. The mental health impact is significant. Many describe symptoms of PTSD, anxiety when hearing Hillsong music, panic attacks when entering church buildings, difficulty trusting any religious authority. Support groups have formed online where former members share their stories, process their experiences, and try to rebuild their faith or leave Christianity entirely. The LGBTQ individuals who were harmed by Hillsong's teachings face particular challenges. Some spent years trying to change their sexual orientation, entering marriages that were doomed to fail, suppressing fundamental aspects of their identity because they were told it was what God required. The suicide rate among young LGBTQ individuals who experienced conversion therapy or similar practices is staggeringly high. Hillsong will never fully account for that harm because much of it is invisible, happening in private moments of despair that never make headlines. The survivors of sexual abuse within the organization, some of whom are only now finding the courage to speak out, face a justice system that often fails to hold religious institutions accountable. The statute of limitations has expired on many cases, Evidence has been destroyed or was never properly collected. Perpetrators have died or fled to countries without extradition. The institutional knowledge of abuse was carefully managed to protect the church, not the victims. What strikes me most about the Hillsong story is how predictable it was. Every warning sign was there. The lack of accountability, the celebrity culture, the financial opacity, the rapid expansion without proper oversight, the pattern of protecting institutional reputation over individual well-being. We've seen this story before in different contexts. Enron, Theranos, the Catholic Church abuse scandals, the fall of mega ministries like Jim Backer's PTL or Ted Haggard's New Life Church. The details change, but the pattern remains the same. Charismatic leadership, unchecked power, loyal followers who don't ask hard questions, and a slow-motion collapse when the truth finally surfaces. Here's the question that haunts me. How many people saw the warning signs and said nothing? How many staff members knew about Carl Lentz's affairs before 2020? How many board members knew about Brian Houston's inappropriate behavior? How many volunteers witnessed financial irregularities or heard concerning stories but stayed silent because questioning leadership was treated as spiritual rebellion? In high-control organizations, whistleblowers are punished, not protected. Speaking truth to power gets you labeled divisive, critical, bitter, or satanic. So people learn to keep their mouths shut, to explain away what they see, to trust that leadership knows best. The tragedy is that many people genuinely encountered something meaningful at Hillsong. They made real friends. They experienced moments of authentic spiritual connection. They found community and purpose. That doesn't disappear just because the institution was corrupt. But it does become complicated. How do you hold both realities? That your experience was real and meaningful, and that the organization facilitating it was causing immense harm? That's the question tens of thousands of former Hillsong members are grappling with right now. What profession are you in? I'm curious because I wonder how this story resonates differently depending on your field. If you're in business, you might see this as a case study in organizational failure. If you're in psychology, you might focus on the trauma and manipulation. If you're in ministry, this might terrify you, or vindicate concerns you've had about megachurch culture. Drop a comment. I genuinely want to know your perspective. So where does this leave us? As of 2024, Hillsong still exists, but it's a fraction of what it once was. The brand that once represented the future of Christianity now represents cautionary tale. Churches around the world are implementing new accountability structures, trying to avoid becoming the next Hillsong. The conversation about megachurch culture, celebrity pastors, and the intersection of faith and money has intensified. Some see this as a healthy reckoning. Others see it as an attack on Christianity itself. What's clear is that 150,000 people who once called Hillsong their spiritual home are now scattered. Some have found new churches. Some have left Christianity entirely. Some are still processing what happened, trying to separate the genuine faith experiences they had from the institutional failures that betrayed them. The community that once filled stadiums and dominated Christian music charts is now a diaspora, united only by shared disillusionment. The most important question isn't what happened to Hillsong, it's what we learned from it. Because the factors that enabled Hillsong's rise and fall, unchecked power, financial secrecy, celebrity culture, lack of accountability, these exist in countless organizations right now. They're not unique to churches. They're not unique to Christianity. They're patterns of human behavior that emerge whenever people gain power without oversight, whenever loyalty is valued over honesty, whenever protecting an institution becomes more important than protecting people. This is Professor Archive, and if you found value in this deep dive into one of the most significant religious collapses in modern history, consider that super thanks button. It really does help keep these stories coming. But more importantly, share this video with someone who needs to understand what happened. Whether they're a former Hillsong member processing their experience, someone currently in a high-control organization wondering if they should be concerned, or just someone fascinated by how empires fall. The Hillsong story isn't over. There will be more revelations, more lawsuits, more testimonies from survivors. The full accounting of harm will take years, maybe decades. But the central truth is already clear. An organization that promised to change the world through faith, hope, and love ended up demonstrating the oldest lesson in human history. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and no amount of worship music, light shows, or celebrity endorsements can cover up the rot when it finally surfaces. The 150,000 people who once filled Hillsong services learned that lesson the hard way. The question is, will the rest of us learn it before history repeats itself again?